I'm not sure why this is, but it may be because we're so interested in the actors, whether new actors or old actors, that we neglect studying the interactions between them and their opponents. And I've used the term repression, but I should have used a much broader word. I should have used the term social control. Because physical repression is only one mechanism that elites use to control contention. States can cut off the funding of organizations. They can pass tax laws against them. They can impose restrictions on people who have been arrested at demonstrations. They can set up community policing systems to monitor contention. Even in democratic systems, governments have substantial influence on how the media treats protest, and they control the content of the internet. In the new century, a serious issue is whether such social control is increasing in liberal democratic states in the wake of the terrorist outrages of 2001 in the United States, 2004 in Spain, and 2007 in Britain. In all three of these countries, changes in police practice against terrorism have been expanded to the social control of non-terrorist protests and raise concern about the suppression of all forms of protest. Because I know it best, let me just talk briefly about the United States. After the outrages of 2001, the swift passage of the U.S. Patriot Act began to threaten not only terrorism but all forms of human rights and contentious politics. There's been increased use of preventive detention. In the case of terrorist suspects, the use of torture and detention without trial. In June of this year, with the enthusiastic support of the Obama administration, the American Supreme Court banned domestic groups from providing advice, even advice on how to engage in peaceful negotiations, to groups that had been labeled terrorists by the government. There is the fear of the strategy of suppressing terrorism spreading to the suppression of all forms of dissent and human rights. How have Americans responded to these threats? In protesting against the threat of suppression, American activists have been employing three different strategies. First, what I call cause lawyers. With the aggressive expansion of executive powers under the second Bush administration, the role of lawyers has become prominent in conflicts over habeas corpus rights of Guantanamo detainees, in the protection of privacy, and in the growing issue of undocumented South American immigrants. Lawyers have been organizing in ways that resemble how social movements form networks, how they frame their claims, and how they intersect with authorities. So lawyers are increasingly engaging in contentious politics. Second, private organizations like the American Bar Association have been important in defending citizens' rights against government intrusion. An unusual example, the American Librarians Association denounced an article of the U.S. Patriot Act which allowed the FBI, the American Security Police, access to the records of the library loans of individual lenders. Working with the American Civil Liberties Union, the librarians exposed not only the threats, but the absurdities of the act. Finally, local networks, more typical of social movement activities, have been working at the grassroots level to protect First Amendment rights. Beginning in New England, where the institution of the town meeting began, and based at first on established civil liberties groups, a national network of supporters of First Amendment civil liberties rights have been formed. Now, my inclusion of lawyers, librarians, and civil liberties groups in a lecture about contentious politics may surprise new students of social movements. After all, such groups don't use the traditional disruptive forms of action that we usually associate with social movements. They haven't created sustained movement organizations, and they frame their demands around the traditional values of American political culture. But if we want to understand all of contentious politics, and not simply social movements, then we need to develop models that will help us to understand lawyers and librarians, teachers, internet hackers, and other citizens groups, and the forms of contention that they use. Just as social movements often cross the boundary of the polity into routine politics, mainstream actors occasionally venture into the less familiar territory of transgressive politics. So let me close with some challenges to social movement scholarship. I've already focused on one such challenge. My hope of convincing you to expand the field of social movements to the study of contentious politics in general. But there are four other issues that seem to me pressing for social movement scholars at the present time. First, what about movements that don't target the state? Do they fall outside the range of contentious politics, or do they follow similar mechanisms and processes, except that their targets are private corporations or other private groups? In recent years, for example, there have been a number of stockholder revolts against corporations in the United States and Europe. These don't look like traditional social movements, but they certainly qualify as contentious politics. I think the next generation of scholars will have to take these protests more seriously. Second, do new forms of contentious action, particularly internet-based campaigns, challenge existing approaches, or will they eventually be absorbed into the repertoire of contention, like the trade unions were in the 20th century? A number of scholars have argued forcefully that the internet has transformed not only how people communicate, but also the basic organization of social movements. If a group of students who know how to set up a website can organize themselves as a social movement, what happens to the traditional forms of social movement organization that we've inherited from the past? Are they going to be replaced? Are they going to absorb the new internet-based methods? Or is some hybrid form of movement organization going to result? Third, there's recently been a growing interest in social networks, both in Brazil and in the United States. And in my paper, I cite a number of scholars who are in this room who have been using the concept of networks. This is a refreshing development, but there's a danger that the term network, a microstructural net concept, will have the same defect as the old macrostructural concepts, I'm referring to social class, and that is the danger that it will satisfy itself with identifying the links between the actors in the networks and fail to specify the mechanisms and processes that translate structure into action. You have in Brazilian studies a marvelous example of how network analysis can specify mechanisms and processes in a dynamic framework. And I'm referring to sociologist Lígia's study of Brazilian Youth Organizations, which was published in English